Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. And today we're going to be answering a pretty common question that I get asked. What war were the Iowa-class battleships most effective during? So this one is completely open to interpretation. I'm going to go through the various wars that the Iowas participated in and a couple of war-adjacent, more concept-y things. You'll get what I mean when I get there. And we'll talk about which of those the Iowas were most effective during, in my opinion, and the criteria I'm using for that. So, first of all, the least effective war that the Iowa-class battleships were in. The tanker war. So during the Iran-Iraq War, the waters of the Persian Gulf were fairly heavily mined. There were multiple threats made against merchant shipping in those waters, and a number of American ships, such as USS Stark and USS Samuel B. Roberts, were damaged operating in the Persian Gulf. So the US Navy sent the Iowa-class battleships on rotation as part of the force that was convoying merchant ships in those waters during the conflict. This takes place shortly before the Gulf War. Long story short, battleships make horrible minesweepers, and they're not great as convoy escorts unless you're expecting enemy battleships to be operating as commerce raiders. So the battleships were put in severe danger. A mine probably wouldn't sink a battleship, but it would do enough damage to mission kill her and send her home, requiring a massive amount of repairs. These ships were relatively old at that point, and they were not very effective. What's more, when New Jersey is sent to participate in 89-90, she doesn't even have paravanes anymore. She can't minesweep. The various Iowa-class battleships that are sent tend to have underwater demolition teams assigned, so you're using a 57,000-ton warship to transport a SEAL team of scuba divers to go out and cut mines so you can then shoot them with rifles from the deck of the battleship and set them off. That is a terrible way to do minesweeping. So the use of the Iowa-class battleships in the Persian Gulf during the tanker war makes absolutely no sense to me. Next up, the Lebanese Civil War. Shortly after being recommissioned and before being 100% combat effective, New Jersey is raced from the Pacific across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean to be part of the United Nations peacekeeping force off Lebanon. Battleships make fantastic deterrents against peer nation states. Lebanon proves that battleships are horrible deterrents against terrorism. New Jersey was unable to impact the decision of terrorists to blow up the Marine Corps barracks, and her presence may well have escalated tensions in the region. What's more, because she had not been fully reactivated, her missile systems were not used. Only 8 of her 9 guns, main battery guns, were operable. The powder was not in good condition, and so her shells were inaccurate, which could have also been hampered by the level of training that the crew had, or the level of restoration that was done to the main battery fire control equipment when the ship was rushed into service. So, New Jersey was relatively ineffective, in my opinion, during her use in the Lebanese Civil War. Really, the biggest problem here is not the ship's condition. She was combat capable at that point, and it certainly wasn't the crew's training. It was the fact that we sent a battleship to fight terrorism, and it just doesn't work. The next least effective war for the Iowa-class battleships, I would argue, is the Korean War. The Iowas have a lot of great capabilities, and even though they weren't the queens of the sea anymore, they were still capable ships. Korea, being a peninsula, has a lot of coastline, and with a rugged mountainous interior, much of the lines of communication for the Chinese and North Koreans was concentrated along that coast. However, that was also in range of the cruisers, the 6 and 8 inch gun armed cruisers, which were still around in large numbers during the Korean War. So those cruisers could much more cheaply do the job of the Iowa-class battleships. Perhaps the most capable thing that the Iowa-class battleships do during the Korean War, because they're used very similarly to World War II. They're refueling ships. They were pretty good at that. They were being used as anti-aircraft escorts for the carriers. Terrible at that by Korea. They can shoot down propeller planes, not jet planes, especially with their World War II era anti-aircraft armament, which is gradually being reduced during this war. They're being used as shore bombardment, but again, there are other ships that are able to do that, and they're being used as command and control vessels. It was almost always an Iowa-class battleship that was the flagship of 7th Fleet, with New Jersey being the final 7th Fleet flagship during the war. They have significantly larger command and control facilities for fleet command, but that's not much justification to have a battleship on station the whole time. What's more, the battleships were all home ported in Norfolk to save money by concentrating them in one place, which meant that only one Iowa-class battleship at a time was available for use off Korea. So we're paying for 4 battleships to have one battleship in the war, and it's got to sail halfway around the world to get there. So the use of Iowa-class battleships during Korea is the 3rd least effective, in my opinion. In 4th place, I would argue World War II. This is the point where you guys are probably calling me heretics. World War II is still more or less in the age of the battleship. And that's one of the reasons why World War II is so high on the list, and also one of the reasons why it's so low. On the one hand, there are plenty of other battleships nearly as capable of the Iowas that are out there. On the other hand, there are enemy battleships that the Iowas could have fought, and had they been employed properly, they may have gotten a chance to fight those enemy battleships. Their anti-aircraft batteries were effective. As fleet flagships operating as carrier escorts, they were effective. I do not believe that battleships were made obsolete by aircraft carriers or were obsolete during World War II. However, they had stepped down from the top tier warship to a second tier one, which is hard to justify for a battleship as large and expensive as the Iowa class. Because the Iowas are being used as fleet flagships and escorting the carriers, they have relatively little training or experience or deployment in the shore bombardment role, which is what battleships will start to excel at from World War II on. However, the Iowa class consistently shot worse in a shore bombardment role than the older battleships, even with their worse fire control systems, because they got less experience with it. They didn't have much time to train for main battery stuff because they were always being employed as anti-aircraft escorts for the carriers. So World War II, still within their heyday, but the Iowa-class battleships were not particularly effectively employed or unique enough to land World War II higher on my list. Next up, I've got the Cold War. This isn't a shooting war. It's kind of abstract, but I would argue that the Iowa-class battleships are fairly effective during this war and are part of the reason why it wasn't a shooting war. But more importantly, the reason this is higher than World War II is I believe that the recommissioning of the Iowa-class battleships in the 80s directly contributes to the end of the Cold War and resolving that without any violence. And so that's why the Cold War is so high on my list. I should say without any direct violence between the United States and the Soviet Union. Obviously, there are a number of other conflicts that take place during the Cold War, many of which that the United States take place in are listed separately here on the list. Next up, the Vietnam War. As the only battleship anywhere in the world, and at a time when the all-gun cruisers are rapidly being taken out of service, New Jersey was extremely effective as a shore bombardment during the Vietnam War. Vietnam is a long strip of coastline, which left a lot of room for the battleship to be able to fire her guns effectively. She was pretty effectively employed for her single deployment there. So much so that allegedly the Vietnamese would not come to the Paris peace talks unless New Jersey was taken out of service, which is one of the reasons why it is suggested that she only does a single deployment there. It is unfortunate that New Jersey's activation takes place right as the United States starts to reduce its footprint in Vietnam. had the Iowa class started to be reactivated earlier on. You may well have seen multiple Iowa class battleships there. Also during this war, New Jersey's use was able to most likely, and it's almost impossible to quantify this, but she was able to save the lives of naval aviators and Air Force pilots for that matter too. But aircraft are being shot down in large numbers as they're trying to bomb these targets, and New Jersey was able to safely, without risking any of her crew, engage those same targets from 20 miles offshore. And her projectiles were significantly cheaper than aerial bombs or jet aircraft. Next up, the most effective war, in my opinion, for the Iowa-class battleships, though not the most effective one on my list, we'll get to that in a minute, is the Gulf War. The employment of Missouri and Wisconsin during the Gulf War led to the Iraqis deploying a large number of their troops away from the Saudi Arabian desert where the main American offensive was going to come, even though their intelligence showed a buildup of American forces there, and instead had them deployed to the Kuwaiti coast. They believed that the main attack would come where the battleships were. The battleships were then able to employ extremely effective shore bombardment, which kept those troops pinned in place during the Allied blitz across the desert, and eventually led to them surrendering to unmanned craft from the battleships without endangering any service personnel that had to go in and fight them personally. So the battleships are extremely effective during this war because they're able to pin forces in place and destroy them without ground combat, which never happens. Usually the battleships are used to soften up a target before ground forces go in. Now, this showed that battleships could destroy divisions of ground forces without needing your own forces to go in and take them out. You just needed guys to go in and guard them as prisoners of war. Next up on my list is another one that's hard to quantify, but I think it is one of the most valuable uses of Iowa-class battleships. And that was all the wars that were never fought. And it's impossible to say what wars were not fought because of the Iowa-class battleships, but so often throughout the Cold War, the various Iowas are sent to South America, to Turkey or the Mediterranean, to the Western Pacific, off the coast of Korea or Vietnam or China, the Taiwan Straits, the Persian Gulf. They're sent to all of these places that are seen as hotspots, and then begins the process of de-escalation. And again, it's impossible to quantify how many of these would have turned into actual shooting wars that would have cost lives if the Iowa class weren't there. But if just one of these conflicts was prevented by one of the Iowa class battleships showing up, then that is the most valuable use of these ships. They, again, do not act as a good deterrent against terrorism, but they are a tremendous deterrent against peer adversaries. But what do I think is the most important use of the Iowa-class battleships, and realistically the only use of them that justifies the initial cost of building them, because there were always other ships that could do these other jobs? That is their service after they've been in the Navy as museum ships. The Iowa-class battleships have now served longer as museum ships than they ever served actively. And they are going to continue to serve in this role for decades to come. They cost the US government $0. We get no federal support to operate these ships as museum ships. So it's free for the government. They're telling the Navy's story. They're giving regular visitors the Navy experience, what it's like, and that contributes greatly to Navy recruiting. Military recruitment in this all-volunteer military is way down, especially this year. The Navy's something like 50,000 recruits shy of its goals, which means that they aren't able to meet all of their needs. They can't man the aviation squadrons, the submarines, the surface ships as much as they needed. But Iowa-class battleships serve as the first touch point for over 1 million visitors a year, the first touch point to the military. When they were built with the all draft military, everybody had a family member who had served. And they went to that family member to ask, hey, what was it like to serve? Who do I go to talk to enlist? That's not the case anymore. Since we've switched to a smaller, all-volunteer force, the number of Americans who have military persons in their family is some ridiculously low single-digit number. And I'm not sure what the most recent one is. 2% comes to mind, but that might be off. So a really, really low number. So where are they going to meet veterans, to see what it's like to serve in the military, to experience that as their first touch point, to go around and be like, wow, this is cool. I want to be a part of that continuing Navy story. The various museum ships in this country, of which the Iowa-class battleships are some of the, definitely the most beautiful, but some of the most visited. So, what is your list of the most effective wars and other things that are sort of vaguely related, uses of the Iowa-class battleships? Let us know in the comment section down below. Do you think I got it all wrong? Do you think World War II should have been at the top of the list? Or do you think that they aren't being effectively used as museums? Let us know in the comment section down below. I have to say, this list sort of surprised even me as I was going through and writing them down. So if you think I'm completely off the bat, let me know your list down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. Really appreciate your support. There's a link in the description below if you'd like to continue to donate to support the museum. Remember, we get no federal money, and we're really helping the military by being here. You can also support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us and our channel. Thanks for watching.